If you're listening to this while settling into bed, you can allow your shoulders to get a little heavier, your breathing a little slower. No. Tonight, we're going to visit the quieter corner of Olympus. The kind of place with a warm fire, a comfortable chair, and nobody arguing about golden apples. This is the realm of Hestia, the goddess of the hearth, of home, and of peaceful, everyday warmth. And yes, if you're thinking, that sounds pleasantly boring, you're exactly in the right place. Greek mythology is often presented like an endless soap opera with divine special effects. Zeus has a new plan. Hera is understandably annoyed. Athena arrives with strategy. Ares arrives with weaponry. Hermes drops in with messages and sarcasm. Poseidon shakes the ocean just for emphasis. And somewhere in the background, Dionysus is hosting a party that nobody fully understands but everyone agrees is interesting. And then there's Hestia, quiet, calm, sitting by the fire, keeping the world together in the most ordinary and essential way imaginable. In the ancient Greek imagination, the hearth wasn't just a fireplace. It was the symbolic center of the home, and, in a larger sense, the symbolic heart of the city and of the cosmos. This is supported by multiple classical sources, and although each writer shades the symbolism slightly differently, the theme is consistent. The hearth meant warmth, continuity, and hospitality. So when the Greeks placed Hestia at the hearth, they weren't saying she was unimportant. Quite the opposite. They were saying that life itself rests on the small, repeating acts that sustain us. Lighting a fire, warming food, welcoming a guest, creating a sense of belonging. This might imply that Hestia was more like the quiet glue of the universe than a background character. Based on what we know from Greek ritual practice, honoring Hestia was often the first act in ceremonies and sacrifices, suggesting she held a kind of serene priority. Not glamorous, but quietly essential. Imagine, then, that we're visiting Mount Olympus. But instead of the usual soaring palaces and shout-filled throne rooms, we're walking slowly into a smaller hall, one with soft light flickering across polished stone. There's a central fire burning steadily, not roaring, not crackling dramatically, just glowing in that way embers do when they've been tended lovingly for a very long time. Around us, the room feels surprisingly domestic, not in a modern way. There are no couches or scented candles, but in a timeless sense of calm order. The kind of place where things are always where they belong, where the temperature is always slightly perfect, where you feel, without needing to be told, that you are safe here. This is Hestia's space. She is not usually depicted with elaborate weapons, or winged sandals, or thunderbolts, or dramatic monsters. Artistic representations where they survive tend to show her as dignified, veiled, sometimes seated, sometimes standing calmly. Nothing shouts. Nothing sparkles too loudly. Nothing breaks the peace. And yet, in the mythic hierarchy, she is one of the Olympians, not a minor spirit, not a passing character. One of the core divine figures. One of the 12, or, depending on the tradition, peacefully stepping aside so that Dionysus could take her place while she continued to be honored in every home. That detail varies by source, and scholars caution against assuming there was only one fixed list. But the broader picture remains. Hestia is foundational. This foundation also existed in real-world practice. In Greek households, the hearth was sacred. When a baby was formally accepted into the family, there was a ritual involving the hearth. When a guest entered, the hearth symbolized hospitality. When a city founded a new colony, they sometimes carried fire from the mother city's hearth to light the hearth of the new settlement. These examples come from classical texts and archaeological interpretations. While exact details vary by time and place, the symbolism is reliably attested. So Hestia wasn't just the goddess of a fireplace. She was the goddess of connection and continuity across space and time. But, and this may be the most relaxing part, she accomplished all of this without chasing attention, starting feuds, or demanding epic quests. In many myths, she appears less as an active plot driver and more as a reassuring presence. A constant, a reminder that while heroes and gods rush about, someone keeps the flame going, And for a sleep-friendly story, this is perfect. We won't need to worry about Medusa's snakes, or the Minotaur's labyrinth, or the Trojan War, or any other scenes involving chaos, noise, or shouting. Instead, we can simply sit here, by the fire, listening to the gentle whisper of mythology that prefers subtlety over spectacle. As we talk about Hestia, we'll also gently wander through other parts of Greek life, the layout of homes, the meanings of rituals, how households functioned, and how ancient people thought about peace, order, and hospitality. When a historical record becomes unclear, which it sometimes does, I'll let you know, using phrases like this could imply, or it is often interpreted, so you can relax knowing what is solid and what is reflective interpretation. But always calmly, always gently, always with a tone that feels a little bit like being wrapped in a warm blanket. For now, you can imagine arriving at a small Greek home, maybe somewhere in a hillside village overlooking olive groves. The walls are whitewashed. The door is wooden and slightly weathered. Inside, not far from the center of the main room, the hearth glows. Someone has tended it carefully. Bread dough rests nearby. A pot simmers slowly. The pace of life is not frantic. It is steady. And in that steady rhythm, the Greeks saw divinity. That's the world of Hestia. And that's the world we'll gently explore together. If Greek mythology were a grand family gathering, the kind where everyone brings a dish, several people arrive riding magical animals, and at least one uncle turns into a swan for reasons nobody wants to discuss, then Hestia would be the relative who quietly arrives early, helps set the table, remembers everyone's favorite bread, and somehow prevents 5 different arguments simply by existing. To understand Hestia, we begin, as Greek myths so often do, with the Titans. According to the traditional mythic genealogy, the Titans Cronus and Rhea were the parents of several Olympian gods. Hestia was usually said to be the firstborn of their children, though some poetic traditions play flexibly with the order. The general story is that Cronus, worried that one of his children would overthrow him, dealt with this concern in a way that you and I might describe as overly dramatic. He swallowed his children, one by one, shortly after they were born. Yes, quite a family policy. Hestia was among those swallowed, and she remained there, along with her siblings, Demeter, Hera, Hades, and Poseidon, until the youngest child, Zeus, eventually forced Cronus to release them. Different ancient sources vary in how exactly this happened, whether Cronus was tricked, drugged, or compelled, and scholars note that the details depend on the version being told. But in every retelling, the result is the same. The swallowed children reemerge, the Titans are eventually overthrown, and the Olympian order is established. In some later interpretations, because Hestia was the first swallowed and the last released, she was also considered both the eldest and the youngest of the Olympian siblings. This plays nicely into her symbolism. She is first, foundational, but also last, the quiet completion at the end of the cycle. Based on what we know from Greek poetic traditions, this duality seems more symbolic than literal, but it offers a beautifully circular way of imagining her place in the family. Now, if this were the story of most Olympians, we'd now pivot to dramatic adventures, intense quests, or bold declarations of purpose. But Hestia, staying firmly on brand, does none of that. Instead, she becomes the goddess of the hearth, the center of the home, the flame that is tended, nurtured, and kept steady over time. Unlike Athena, she doesn't leap fully formed from anyone's head. Unlike Artemis and Apollo, she doesn't receive bows, lyres, or glowing praise for musical ability. Unlike Aphrodite, she does not become the center of romantic chaos or poetic longing. Unlike Ares, she does not Under any circumstances, pick up a spear and head toward battle. Instead, Hestia chooses stillness. Several mythic traditions describe Hestia as making a vow to remain unmarried and untouched, devoting herself to the hearth and to peace. The details vary by source, as with much of Greek mythology, but the image that emerges is consistent. Hestia is the one who refuses drama. Suitors are sometimes mentioned, notably Poseidon and Apollo, but she gently declines, preferring serenity over spectacle. If Greek gods had social media accounts, hers would probably just be a looping image of a fire crackling peacefully, with captions like "Quiet Evening," "Bread Baking," "Please be kind to each other." And, historically speaking, this quietness had weight. In Greek religion, the hearth was linked to Hestia's presence. Each household had its own sacred fire, and that fire symbolized continuity, not just of warmth, but of family lineage, hospitality, and order. Before sacrifices or rituals began, Hestia's share often came first, a gesture that acknowledged the grounding role of the hearth in every sacred act. Surviving literary references support this pattern, though exact practices could vary between city-states and through time. Hestia also had a civic role. Many Greek cities had a public hearth, sometimes located in a central administrative building. This flame signified the spirit of the community itself. When a new colony was founded, the settlers sometimes carried fire from the mother city's sacred hearth to light the new one. This practice, described in classical accounts, reinforced the idea that Hestia's fire bound people together across distance. In other words, Hestia was home, not as a physical address, but as a concept, and unlike many gods, she rarely appears in myths as a main character doing dramatic things. Her importance is ritual, symbolic, steady. That doesn't mean she lacks significance. It simply means she belonged to the world of quiet power. There's also something gently human about Hestia. While other gods represent forces that rise, crash, burn, or rage, she represents the feeling of sitting down at the end of the day, letting your muscles relax, and knowing there is warmth and stability somewhere nearby. Based on what we know from anthropological perspectives on religion, gods like Hestia often emerge where domestic life becomes central to social identity. Her presence reflects how essential the home was, especially the shared fire, in pre-modern life. Her very name, Hestia, is closely tied to the Greek word for hearth. Unlike some gods whose names drifted or adapted or traveled under many aliases, hers is almost inseparable from the object and idea she represents. This suggests a deeply rooted association, one that may stretch back beyond the poetic myths into earlier household religion. We can cautiously infer this from linguistic and ritual patterns across Greek culture. It's interesting to notice how non-competitive Hestia is. The Olympian world is full of rivalries for love, honor, power, worshippers' attention, yet Hestia appears largely uninterested in any of that. In some traditions, when Dionysus arrives and becomes part of the Olympian circle, Hestia is said to graciously yield her formal seat to him, preferring peace over political structure. Ancient texts differ on how literal that giving up a seat story was meant to be, but symbolically, it communicates exactly who she is, the one who values harmony over hierarchy. There's a quiet strength in that. If you imagine the Olympian family seated around a grand table, Zeus at the head, Hera beside him, Athena with scrolls, Apollo with a lyre, Hermes with his winged sandals kicked casually under his chair, Ares sharpening something unnecessarily. Hestia might be the one refilling cups, gently reminding people to speak kindly and making sure the bread doesn't burn. She doesn't raise her voice. She doesn't need to. The fire glows either way, in art and sculpture. Hestia is sometimes shown seated, veiled, composed, conveying modesty and calm authority. She's not an abstract idea. She's a presence, but a presence that reassures rather than overwhelms. Where Zeus commands storms, Hestia commands comfort. And perhaps that's why she can feel a little invisible at first glance. Many modern retellings prefer gods who shout, strike, seduce, or transform dramatically. Hestia does none of these. She simply steadies things. Based on what we know of Greek domestic life, this steadiness would have been deeply meaningful. Fires had to be tended. Homes had to be stable. Guests had to be welcomed. Without those acts, society doesn't hold together. So Hestia is not the absence of action. She is the presence of care. In that sense, she was one of the most universal deities. Every home had a hearth. Every hearth had meaning. And every family, whether rich or poor, knew the ritual gestures that acknowledged her. Tonight, as we slowly drift through this mythic landscape, it might be comforting to picture that glow. Not the chaotic fire of lightning, but the soft flame of constancy. A light that doesn't demand anything. A light that simply invites you to rest. And resting, especially here, is very welcome. If you were to step inside an ancient Greek home, the first thing you might notice, after your eyes adjusted to the softer light, would be the hearth. Not a dramatic, roaring bonfire, but a steady, useful flame. A flame that cooked meals, warmed rooms, and quietly reminded everyone present that they belonged somewhere. The hearth was not always grand. In many homes, it was simply a fire pit or a modest-built structure in the main room. But scale didn't matter. What mattered was presence. The continual flame that linked the family to the divine, to tradition, and to one another. Greek writers refer to this again and again. The hearth meant home. It meant origin, protection, continuity, and identity. It was both literal and symbolic. Heating soup while symbolizing stability. And standing quietly behind that flame, so to speak, was Hestia. The ancient Greeks lived in a world where a fire going out was not just inconvenient. It could be dangerous or exhausting to restart. Maintaining a flame required attention. This could imply that the hearth naturally became a focus point for care, patience, and routine. Based on what we know of ritual practice, tending the hearth wasn't just a chore. It was often a small act of reverence. But the hearth's meaning extended beyond the home. In the center of a Greek city, there was often a public hearth associated with the civic government or communal space. This flame didn't belong to any single household. It belonged to everyone. It symbolized the shared life of the city itself. The sense that, however large the population or however complex the politics, there was still a single heart glowing at the center. From that central fire, new beginnings could literally be lit. When Greeks founded a new colony, they sometimes carried a flame from the mother city's hearth to ignite the first fire in the new settlement. This practice, recorded in classical sources, wasn't merely practical. It was profoundly symbolic. It said, in effect, you may be far away, but you are still connected. The hearth also marked transitions. When a child was formally recognized as part of the household, some traditions describe ceremonies involving the hearth. bringing the child near the sacred flame as a symbol of inclusion and protection. Exact details could differ by region and era, but the repeated motif suggests the hearth was seen as a threshold between outsider and insider. This is where Hestia's character becomes clearer. She is not the goddess of flashy miracles or dramatic rescues. She is the goddess of the ongoing, the unbroken, the ordinary rhythm that sustains life without drawing attention to itself. You can imagine a quiet evening thousands of years ago. The day's work is finished. The tools are set aside. Dinner simmers slowly. A family sits near the fire, talking softly or simply existing together in silence. The flames shift. Shadows move lazily across the walls. The warmth is constant. There is no audience and no spectacle. Yet in that moment, the Greeks saw divinity. It wasn't that the hearth was literally Hestia, but rather that Hestia was present through it. Just as Athena was linked to wisdom, Ares to battle, and Demeter to grain, Hestia was linked to this steady flame and the peace surrounding it. Hospitality, so crucial in Greek culture, was also bound to the hearth. Guests did not simply enter a building. They entered a sacred domestic space. Bread was shared. Wine was poured. A guest was protected, not only by the host's goodwill, but by religious expectation. Based on literary references, failing to honor hospitality could be seen as an offense not only against the visitor, but against the divine order itself. And at the center of hospitality, the hearth. And at that heart was an abiding stillness. Contrast this with the lives of other mythic figures. Hermes flies, Ares charges, Artemis runs through forests, Apollo travels with his music, Athena strategizes and builds cities. Hestia does not roam or perform, she dwells. Her power is not movement. Her power is being. There's something very soothing about that, especially if you're listening while drifting toward sleep. In a world full of noise, Hestia represents the softest, most enduring sound, the gentle whisper of a fire that has been burning all day and will still be burning when you wake. Imagine closing your eyes near such a hearth. You'd feel warmth across your face. You might hear the faintest crackle, the lightest shift of ash. Conversation settles into murmurs and then fades. Outside, perhaps cicadas or waves or night birds continue their own timeless rhythms. Inside, everything is calm. And somewhere within that calm, the Greeks imagined a goddess was present, not demanding, not scolding, not judging, just being. And in a way, that may be what people most wanted from the divine at the end of the day. Not spectacle, but assurance. Not thunder, but continuity. A promise that tomorrow would look enough like today that you could rest without fear. Hestia, through the hearth, offered that. When we consider how ancient religion functioned, this steady symbolism makes sense. Religion wasn't only about dramatic temple rituals or oracles making pronouncements. It was also about daily gestures, lighting a flame, murmuring a blessing, sharing bread, welcoming neighbors. Hestia lived inside those gestures. And as we continue through her story, we'll see how her choice of peace over drama fits naturally with the world she represented. The world of fire without flames, burning without chaos, living without noise, sustaining without demanding applause. It's a reassuring thought that sometimes the strongest presence is also the quietest. You can see how this shaped social life. The hearth wasn't just about warmth, it was about inclusion. It symbolized that a stranger had become, at least temporarily, part of the household circle. A guest might sit beside the fire, feel the heat on their hands, and know they were safe for the night. In this sense, Hestia's domain extended beyond the physical home into the moral imagination. Her flame represented right relationship, family harmony, civic unity, and kindness to strangers. It's also notable how unchanging the hearth was meant to be. Fires needed tending, but they also symbolized permanence. A city's hearth might burn continuously for years, sometimes longer, representing that the community itself endured through festivals, wars, harvests, arguments, weddings, and losses. So if Zeus was the sky and Poseidon the sea, Hestia was the steady center, the axis around which daily life quietly turned. What's interesting and feels very human is how unremarkable this becomes over time. People get used to constants. A flame that never falters can begin to feel invisible simply because it always does its job. This could imply that Hestia's apparent absence from many mythic stories reflects not a lack of importance, but the kind of essential normalcy that keeps everything functioning. In other words, Hestia is always there, so reliably that storytellers rarely felt the need to point it out. The hearth also shaped architecture and movement. People gathered around it. Meals were organized around it. Social interaction flowed toward its warmth. Unlike modern houses with many rooms and many distractions, the ancient Greek home often revolved physically and emotionally around this central space. Some scholars suggest that the hearth symbolized order because it anchored the household physically, spiritually, and socially. While interpretations vary, the pattern is clear. Whatever else a Greek house contained, the hearth was the heart. If Mount Olympus had an official most likely to avoid drama award, Hestia would probably receive it every century or so. Not because she campaigned for it, but because everyone quietly agreed it belonged to her, and she wouldn't make a fuss about accepting it. In a world filled with gods who hurl lightning, race across seas, argue, transform, compete, boast, scheme, and occasionally turn humans into trees or stars, Hestia does something almost radical. She chooses peace. Ancient sources describe Hestia as a virgin goddess, like Athena and Artemis, meaning she remained unmarried and unattached. In some myths, both Apollo and Poseidon sought her hand. These are not insignificant figures to politely decline. Apollo, radiant, poetic, musically gifted, divinely charming. Poseidon, powerful, deeply elemental, unpredictable as the sea itself. And yet Hestia says, in essence, no, thank you. Ide prafe tranquility. In some retellings, she swears an oath before Zeus to remain devoted to the hearth and to preserve peace within the Olympian household. Surviving texts phrase this differently depending on the author. And we should remember that Greek myth isn't a single canonized book. It's a tapestry of voices and traditions. But the consistent idea is clear. Hestia abstains from the romantic entanglements that fuel much of mythic storytelling. She steps out of that arena entirely. This decision is striking because so much of Greek mythology revolves around desire, rivalry, jealousy, and competition for affection or status. But Hestia politely steps around the whole whirlwind, almost the way someone at a loud party might smile kindly, refill the snack bowls, and then retreat to the quiet kitchen where the kettle hums peacefully. Her vow isn't framed as withdrawal from life. Instead, it's framed as devotion to steadiness. This decision is striking because so much of Greek mythology revolves around desire, rivalry, jealousy, and competition for affection or status. But Hestia politely steps around the whole whirlwind, almost the way someone at a loud party might smile kindly, refill the snack bowls, and then retreat to the quiet kitchen where the kettle hums peacefully. Her vow isn't framed as withdrawal from life. Instead, it's framed as devotion to steadiness. And when you think about her domain, the hearth, this makes quiet sense. Fires do not chase what they burn. They do not sprint across the countryside to fall in love with a breeze. They simply exist at the center, offering warmth to whoever draws near. They are constant, patient, uncompetitive. Hestia mirrors that quality. Her virginity, in this symbolic reading, could imply untouched order, a space preserved from chaos or imbalance. Based on patterns in Greek religion, virgin goddesses often represented independence from domestic roles associated with marriage and children. In Hestia's case, this independence blends with caretaking in a way that feels almost paradoxical. She is central to the home while remaining personally unattached. It's as if she embodies the home itself, rather than inhabiting any single household as a spouse. Her vow of peace also reflects her temperament within the mythic family. Unlike Athena, who remains unmarried but is active in politics, war strategy, and city building, Hestia avoids arenas of conflict entirely. She doesn't advise generals. She doesn't preside over courtroom disputes. She doesn't stride into battle. She tends the flame. There's a quiet dignity in that choice, one that feels intentional rather than passive. When ancient texts describe her giving up her formal seat among the 12 Olympians so Dionysus could join, they portray it not as a demotion, but as an act of generosity. This specific detail varies across traditions, and scholars often warn against reading it as a universe. Harmony mattered more to Hestia than hierarchy. Imagine the Olympian council chamber, 12 thrones, or sometimes 11 and a spare chair being rearranged. Gods arriving, each with their own energy: thunder, sea spray, laurel leaves, armor, grapes, arrows, scrolls, feathers, and rumors. Voices echo. Opinions fly. Someone gestures dramatically. Someone else leans back and sighs. And there, in the midst of it all, the hearth burns steadily. No speeches, no announcements, just presence. When storytellers say Hestia yields her seat, it's as though she quietly moves her chair slightly away from the table, closer to the fire, still part of the gathering, but not claiming the spotlight. She belongs, but she chooses the corner of peace. This decision might also reflect the Greek understanding of inner order. Hestia governs not the external world, sky, ocean, forests, but the internal world of home and heart. Peace, hospitality, steadiness, continuity. These are not loud virtues. They are not dramatic. They do not win trophies. But they hold worlds together. And because Hestia does not chase stories, fewer myths chase her. This sometimes leads modern readers to think she was less important, but if we step into the mindset of the ancient world, we can see why the opposite may be true. Based on ritual evidence, Hestia's name often came first when sacrifices or prayers began. You didn't start a sacred act without acknowledging the hearth. And when the ritual ended, it might close with her again, the beginning and the end, the alpha and omega of daily worship, not in power but in presence. So while Zeus may thunder, and Athena may weave strategy, and Hermes may flit from realm to realm, Hestia bookends the sacred. That's an extraordinary form of quiet authority. Her vow of peace also shields her from the messy interpersonal drama that fills many myths. She is not insulted by slighted lovers. She is not caught in revenge plots. She is not bargaining for power. By stepping away from those narrative currents, She becomes a kind of still anchor within the mythic sea, and that stillness is contagious. Think of the hearth at the end of a long day. The world has been noisy, carts and markets, waves and work, wind and footsteps. But night comes. The fire remains. You sit near it. Your breathing slows. You watch the flames soften into glowing embers. The quiet isn't empty. It's full. Full of memory, of connection, of the reassuring thought that tomorrow this flame will glow again. Hestia is that thought. She represents a peace chosen, not imposed. A peace that grows out of choosing not to escalate, not to compete, not to rush. A peace founded on boundaries, clear, gentle, unwavering. When we view her vow in this light, it becomes more than a personal decision. It becomes a cosmic orientation, a mythic commitment to the idea that stability matters, that someone must hold the center while others roam. And interestingly, this choice did not isolate her. She was still honored everywhere, in every home, in countless daily gestures, in the quiet greeting of flames being kindled at dawn or preserved at night. Worship wasn't centralized around massive temples in the same spectacular way as some other gods. Instead, it unfolded in living rooms and kitchens, civic halls and colony fire carriers, in humble and repeated acts. Her vow of peace made her universal. There's also a tenderness embedded in this choice. By staying unattached romantically and stepping away from power competition, Hestia becomes available to everyone. The poor farmer, the wealthy merchant, the visiting stranger, the child being welcomed into the household, the city council lighting the public hearth. Her presence does not belong to a single story. It belongs to A, and that, based on everything we know, seems intentional. The Greeks didn't need Hestia to fight monsters. They needed her to keep the fire warm. So when we talk about Hestia's vow of peace, we aren't only describing a mythic vow. We are describing a worldview embodied in a goddess. The belief that goodness can be quiet, that devotion can be steady, that meaning can be found in repetition rather than spectacle. It's the kind of vow that doesn't echo across mountains. It just glows, slowly, without troubling anyone. And if you feel your breath softening a little just thinking about it, that's quite fitting. You're already sitting beside the hearth.
One of the most comforting things about Hestia is that she belonged everywhere. Not only in marble temples, not only in grand citadels, but also, and perhaps especially, in the small, ordinary rooms where daily life unfolded. If Zeus represents the height of the sky and Poseidon the depth of the sea, then Hestia represents the inside of the home. And the truth of Greek life was that most people spent far more time inside homes than on heroic adventures. So her presence would have felt steady and familiar, woven into the rhythm of daily tasks. Let's begin in the most ordinary place of all, the household hearth. Imagine a modest Greek house, stone walls, timber beams, whitewashed surfaces touched by years of sunlight. In the center or main room sits the hearth. Not blazing constantly, fuel was precious, but kept alive in embers or revived when needed. Before meals, prayers or simple gestures of reverence might be offered. Based on literary descriptions, small offerings, a splash of wine, a bit of bread, could be dedicated at the hearth. These weren't theatrical ceremonies with choirs and trumpets. They were soft-spoken acknowledgments that the home was a sacred space. It's important to say that practices varied by region and over time. Greek religion wasn't a single standardized system, but the pattern that emerges from sources is consistent enough to suggest that honoring Hestia at the hearth was widespread and meaningful. And because every household had a hearth, every household was also, in a sense, a small shrine. The home wasn't separate from religion. The home was religious life. Children grew up learning that this flame mattered, that it represented continuity and identity. When a baby was formally welcomed into the family, some accounts describe a ritual involving being brought near the hearth. While details differ, the symbolism is clear. The child now belongs to the circle of warmth. That image lingers. Tiny, footsteps near glowing coals, the room quiet, adults gathered with serious tenderness. The flame doesn't roar or flare, it simply accepts, as it always has. Guests and the sacred welcome hospitality, or xenia, was central in Greek culture. To mistreat a guest was considered deeply wrong, often framed as offending not just the visitor, but the gods themselves. While Zeus was associated with protecting guests, hospitality unfolded within Hestia's domain: the domestic interior, the meal, the chair near the fire. A traveller arrives, perhaps weary and dusty. They are given bread, water, and a place to rest. They sit near the hearth, warming cold hands. That moment, simple as it sounds, was religiously significant. It reinforced the notion that the home was a sacred site of welcome. Hestia didn't just represent the family. She represented the act of turning strangers into temporary kin. This could imply that honoring Hestia wasn't only about maintaining warmth, but about maintaining kindness. And there is something quite sleep-friendly about imagining this. No gates slamming, no stern questions, just soft bread, warm soup, faint firelight, and a space where the world briefly pauses. The public hearth, a city's inner flame. Now we step from the home into the city. Many Greek cities maintained a public hearth, often located in an important civic building. This was more than a decorative fire pit. It symbolized the city's shared life, the idea that, however different its citizens might be, they were joined by a single spiritual home. That fire represented continuity. If the city suffered hardship, the flame endured. If celebrations took place, it glowed alongside them. If leaders changed, markets shifted, or monuments rose and fell, the public hearth still flickered, a sign that the community remained itself. And just as the household hearth was linked to Hestia, so too was the civic one. Her reach stretched comfortably from kitchen to council chamber, from small talk over dinner to the great conversations that shaped cities. This continuity becomes even clearer when we consider colonies. When a group left their city to found a new settlement, ancient writers describe them taking fire from the mother city's hearth. This wasn't only symbolic, it was ceremonial, a way of saying, this new place will still be connected to the old. Our roots glow here too. We can imagine the scene, a vessel carrying carefully shielded coals or flame, a group of travelers watching it closely as they journey. The fire isn't dramatic. It doesn't flare across the sky. It sits there quietly, representing everything familiar. The smells of home cooking, the sound of voices around the table, the warmth at the end of a long day. And like an invisible companion, Hestia travels with them. Temples, or the lack thereof. Interestingly, Hestia doesn't seem to have had as many grand standalone temples as some other gods. Scholars interpret this in different ways, but one reasonable conclusion is that she already had a place everywhere. Every home, every city hall, every shared hearth. She didn't require monumental architecture to be present. Her temple was the world of ordinary living. That makes her unusual and, in its own way, universal. Ritual beginnings and endings. Multiple sources suggest that Hestia's name was invoked at the beginning and end of sacrifices and rituals. This doesn't necessarily mean complex ceremonial language. Sometimes it may have been as simple as a first and last offering. Beginning with Hestia, acknowledged that sacred life starts at home, or more broadly, at the hearth. Ending with her reinforced that all things eventually return to stillness and warmth. So while Zeus might preside over the sky, and Athena over councils, and Poseidon over waves, Hestia framed the sacred experience itself. The first spark, the last ember. Quiet, but essential. From palaces to farmhouses, it's soothing to imagine the continuity across social classes. A wealthy household might have a refined hearth with decorative stone. A poor cottage might have a simple pit lined with earth, and yet both flames, however different in surroundings, would be linked symbolically through Hestia. The palace hearth, glowing beneath high ceilings. The farmhouse hearth, glowing beneath low beams darkened with smoke. Same warmth, same goddess, same meaning. That shared experience might have helped hold society together, not through laws or armies, but through a common emotional landscape of home. Women, work, and the quiet sacred daily tasks, grinding grain, mixing dough, stirring pots, washing, weaving, often took place within sight of the hearth. This means that much of Hestia's sacred space overlapped with spaces traditionally tended by women. We have to be careful not to project modern assumptions backwards too far, but it is reasonable to say that Hestia's sphere honored domestic labor as meaningful, sacred, and central. The home was not merely a backdrop to public life. It was the foundation of it. Hestia, in that sense, sanctified the ordinary. She made everyday life worthy of reverence, and that may be one reason she inspired loyalty, not through fear, but through familiarity. Silence as worship. Unlike some gods who demanded festivals filled with music, noise, or elaborate processions, Hestia could be honored in silence. Sitting quietly near the fire was, in a sense, already part of her ritual world. There is something profoundly restful about that. Worship didn't require spectacle. It required presence. Sit, breathe, watch the flame, feel the warmth. In the ancient world, as now, that might have been the most peaceful moment of the day. The unseen center. So from the grandest palace in a powerful city-state to the most remote farmhouse on a rocky hillside, Hestia's presence flickered softly. She was the goddess, who never left the room, not because she was trapped, but because the room itself was her domain. We might say she was the unseen center of Greek spiritual life. Not loud, not demanding, but always there, which, when you think about it, is often the deepest kind of devotion. And as the fire continues to glow, and as you picture these homes across landscapes and centuries, you might notice your own breathing slowing, matching the rhythm of that steady flame. Hestia would approve of that pace, warm, unhurried, peaceful, exactly as the hearth intended. If you've ever sat quietly in a room full of very different personalities, you'll know that harmony doesn't happen by accident. It happens because someone, or something, provides a steady center. In Greek mythology, that steady center is Hestia. And one of the clearest ways to see her character is to gently compare her with a few of the other Olympian goddesses who shared the same divine neighborhood. Each goddess had her sphere, her tone, and her way of being in the world. Hera, Athena, Aphrodite, their stories swirl with emotion, strategy, beauty, rivalry, and drama. Hestia, on the other hand, glows quietly in the background like a lamp, someone forgot to turn off in the nicest possible way. So let's sit by the hearth and meet her neighbors. Hestia and Hera, order in different keys. Hera, queen of the gods, is often associated with marriage, queenship, and sovereignty. She is regal, imposing, and deeply concerned with loyalty, respect, and the sanctity of marital bonds. Ancient writers frequently describe her as dignified, but also capable of anger when wronged, especially by Zeus's numerous romantic escapades. Hestia and Hera share an interest in order, but they approach it differently. Hera's order is public, ceremonial, and formal. She protects the institution of marriage, the contract, the vows, the social fabric that binds families and lineages. This gives her stories a sharper edge because betrayal wounds the very thing she represents. It makes sense that she reacts strongly when marital vows are broken. The myths reflect that repeatedly. Hestia's order, by contrast, is quietly domestic. She doesn't police relationships. She doesn't issue punishments. She doesn't argue. She maintains harmony, not through authority or enforcement, but through presence. Hera presides. Hestia settles. If Hera is the queen in a ceremonial hall, Hestia is the warm fire in the same building, both essential, but playing different roles. Hera governs households from the outside, the status, the vows, the legitimacy. Hestia nurtures them from within, the warmth, the belonging, the peace by the fire after the guests have gone home. Based on what we know from mythic traditions, Hera is much more visible in stories. She takes action, makes decisions, reacts, responds. Hestia rarely does any of that, yet her significance is reflected in ritual patterns rather than narrative. This difference could imply that Hera ruled institutions, while Hestia tended experiences, two sides of the same cultural coin. And it's worth noticing that Hera often appears in stories where emotions run high. Hestia almost never does. She simply radiates calm. Someone had to. Hestia and Athena. Wisdom versus stillness. Athena, goddess of wisdom, warfare strategy, and crafts, is one of the most celebrated figures in Greek mythology. Born, according to the most famous myth, fully formed from the head of Zeus, she is intellect, discipline, and ingenuity made divine. Like Hestia, Athena is virgin and independent. She doesn't marry, and she isn't swept into the emotional turbulence of romance. But Athena's virginity reflects self-determination and autonomy, often connected with strategy, clarity, and a certain cool rationality. She moves through the world, on battlefields, in cities, in councils, always thinking, always planning. Hestia does not move. Athena changes the world through ideas and action. Hestia changes the world through continuity and warmth. Both are peaceful in their own way, but Athena's peace is the peace that follows wise planning. Hestia's peace is the peace that follows a long day when you sit down, Exhale and let your shoulders drop. Athena is often depicted with armor, a helmet, or an owl. She is watchful, alert, precise. Hestia is usually shown seated or standing still, veiled and serene. The contrast is gentle but meaningful. Based on Greek cultural values, Athena embodies the public virtues of the city: law, order, philosophy, strategy. Hestia embodies the inner virtues of the household and heart. You can imagine them as two different kinds of quiet. Athena's quiet is the silence of a library where great ideas are forming. Hestia's quiet is the hush of a living room late at night while embers glow. Both are calm, but only one makes you sleepy in the best way. And while Athena was central to the identity of specific cities, most famously Athens, Hestia was central everywhere. She didn't belong to one city. She belonged to the idea of home itself. Hestia and Aphrodite. Beauty versus belonging. Aphrodite brings yet another tone into the divine chorus. She is the goddess of love, attraction, desire, beauty, and all the complications that come with them. Her myths are vivid, emotional, and often dramatic, full of longing, jealousy, transformation, and the complex choreography of relationships. Hestia, meanwhile, makes a cup of tea and says gently, "Let's just sit quietly for a while." Aphrodite's world is motion, glances, encounters, fleeting passions, sudden changes of heart. Love pulls people outward toward others. It unsettles, inspires, bewilders. Based on mythic stories, Aphrodite rarely leaves situations untouched. Something, or someone, always shifts. Hestia is the opposite kind of center. If Aphrodite symbolizes the spark that begins connection, Hestia symbolizes the warmth that sustains it. One begins stories, the other holds them together long after the first fireworks fade. This contrast gives insight into how the Greeks understood human life. Love draws us out, makes us vulnerable, pushes us into relationships that can be joyful or painful, or both at once. But home, symbolized by Hestia, is the place where we return after those adventures. Aphrodite says, "Go, feel, love, risk, yearn." Hestia says, "Come back, rest, eat, warm yourself, breathe." Neither is wrong. Both are necessary. And myth sometimes hints, gently, that without Hestia's steadiness, Aphrodite's world might spin too fast. People need a fire to return to. 3 paths, 1 hearth. When we place Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite alongside Hestia, a pattern emerges. Hera guards the structure of marriage. Athena guides the intellect and public life. Aphrodite awakens desire and emotional connection. Hestia nurtures the space that holds them all. Hera shapes the rules. Athena shapes the mind. Aphrodite shapes the heart. Hestia shapes the atmosphere, the feeling of being home, safe, and grounded. It is sometimes said, and this appears symbolically in ancient thought, that every offering began with Hestia. Before anyone prayed to Athena for wisdom, or Hera for protection, or Aphrodite for love, the fire was lit. The hearth was honored. The space was prepared. This could imply that Hestia's role wasn't to compete with other goddesses, but to support them all, to make sure the world itself remained warm, stable, and welcoming enough for any prayer to take place. She is the backdrop, but only in the way the sky is the backdrop to the stars. Always there, always needed, rarely remarked upon, but only because it feels impossible to imagine life without her. The goddess of nothing loud and everything important. So while Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite move through epics and tragedies and love stories, Hestia sits quietly in the corner, keeping the soup warm and the coals glowing, making sure there is always somewhere to return to. And the Greeks, for all their love of heroic tales, understood the holiness of that role. You don't always notice the fire when it's burning well, but you notice it instantly when it goes out. Hestia is the goddess of the fire that never goes out, not a blaze, not a spectacle, just a glow, the kind that makes your eyes a little heavy, the kind that makes conversation soften, the kind that makes the world feel, if only for a moment, safe. And if there is something about that image that makes you want to sink deeper into your pillow and let the day drift quietly away, well, Hestia has done her work once again. When people first meet Hestia in mythology, they sometimes ask, but what are her stories? And the honest and rather soothing answer is that Hestia's stories are quieter than most. She does not dominate epics or stride dramatically across the stage of myth. Instead, she appears at the edges, in rituals, invocations, small moments of peace, and symbolic gestures that feel almost like whispers. Yet these whispers tell us a great deal. They show us a goddess who shapes the emotional temperature of the world rather than its headlines. So let's sit a little closer to the hearth and explore some of the tales, traditions, and glimpses that reveal who Hestia was in the ancient imagination. Calmly, gently, without hurry. The first and the last one of the most meaningful stories about Hestia isn't a single narrative at all. It's a pattern. In Greek ritual practice, Hestia was often invoked first and last. Offerings might begin with her and conclude with her. This isn't merely ceremonial bookkeeping. It carries symbolic weight. Beginning with Hestia, acknowledged that all sacred action starts at home, at the hearth, in a place of belonging and safety. Ending with her suggested that, after all journeys, prayers, negotiations, and anxieties, we return again to that same center. It creates a rhythm, Hestia, world, Hestia. Scholars draw this pattern from references in ancient texts and descriptions of ritual. While exact liturgical formulas likely varied between regions and eras, the underlying theme is dependable enough that we can reasonably say Hestia framed sacred life, not loudly, just consistently, like breathing in and breathing out. Suitors declined, the gentle refusal. Another small but luminous story involves Apollo and Poseidon, both said in certain traditions to have sought Hestia's hand in marriage. Apollo, the golden god of music, light, poetry, and reason. Poseidon, the deep, restless lord of the sea. Either one would make a very mythic husband. But Hestia declines, politely and firmly. She vows before Zeus to remain untouched, devoted to peace, and committed to the hearth. Ancient poets do not always linger on the scene. There are no extended speeches, no grand confrontations. But the fact itself matters. In a mythological world where appetite, attraction, jealousy, and pursuit are constant themes, Hestia quietly refuses the entire narrative arc. No rivalry, no broken hearts, no revenge, no songs of longing across lonely oceans, just calm clarity. This is not my path. Based on how virginity functions symbolically in Greek religion, this decision may indicate independence from entanglement, a kind of sovereignty, grounded not in rule but in stillness. It protects her from the chaos that so often sweeps through Olympus. And perhaps, gently, it protects Olympus from losing its one stable center. The chair for Dionysus, one of the most quietly beautiful traditions about Hestia, tells us that when Dionysus, god of wine, ecstasy, and transformation, joins the Olympians, there is not enough room among the 12. Rather than start a divine argument or reorganize the seating chart with bureaucratic determination, Hestia simply yields her place. She steps aside, not in shame, not because she is lesser, but because she values harmony over hierarchy. It is worth noting, from a careful perspective, that ancient sources differ on how formal this myth was. Some lists of the 12 include Hestia, others include Dionysus. The chair exchange appears symbolic rather than universal, but even as symbolism, it conveys what so many other traditions suggest. Hestia does not cling. She does not grasp power. She makes room, and she remains present anyway. Because, after all, the hearth is never removed from the house simply because it isn't counted as furniture. This story, or symbolic motif, invites reflection. It suggests that real strength can look like yielding, like refusing to escalate, like stepping back so that a new rhythm can enter the room without breaking it. If Greek mythology had a lesson in emotional maturity, this might be it. The hearth and the stranger. While Zeus is often named protector of strangers, the experience of hospitality unfolds around Hestia's flame. Picture a weary traveler arriving at someone's door. A host welcomes them, perhaps after a brief exchange, perhaps with warmth, born of duty and kindness. They are seated near the fire. Bread is offered, water or wine poured. A meal appears, simple yet sustaining. The guest is safe for the night. This moment happens so often in Greek literature, sometimes highlighted, sometimes taken for granted, that it becomes a kind of narrative ritual. And the hearth is always there. This could imply that Hestia's presence sanctified not only the space of the home, but the act of turning an outsider into an honored guest. She does not appear in these scenes as a character with dialogue, but she is there, as atmosphere, as symbol, as the warmth that allows trust to grow, and that kind of presence is so gentle you hardly notice it, until you imagine life without it. Festivals and reverence Hestia did not have the most flamboyant festivals, at least not in the way Dionysus or Athena did. But she was woven into countless rituals as a constant companion deity. At the start of a sacrifice, a prayer. At the lighting of a household fire, a gesture. At civic ceremonies, an invocation. Hestia is rarely center stage, but she is always there when the curtain rises, and still there when it falls. Some traditions link her particularly with Prytania, the civic hearths of Greek cities. This was where official hospitality and civic rituals might occur. There's a sense that Hestia presides silently over shared life, not in the marketplace noise, but in the symbolic heart of community. Again, we must be careful. Practices differed, and what was true in one city wasn't necessarily identical in another, but the pattern repeats widely enough that it forms a recognizable theme. Hestia is the guardian of the center. Not the walls, not the gates. The center. The place you return to. A goddess without scandal. One of the most striking things about Hestia's mythic record is what is not there. No major feuds, no dramatic betrayals, no epic adventures, no tragic punishments, no curses, no complicated revenge arcs requiring family charts to keep track of. In a mythological tradition full of emotion, passion, conflict, and spectacle. Hestia simply doesn't participate. This is not absence, it is restraint, and it gives the impression that Hestia is the one Olympian who, if you invited her to a quiet dinner, would show up on time, help wash dishes afterward, and leave you feeling gently reassured about the state of the universe. Her lack of scandal is not a lack of personality. It's a commitment to calm. And if you're listening to this as you drift toward sleep, perhaps you can feel that calm settling around the story, like a soft blanket. Fire as memory. The ancient Greeks sometimes thought of the hearth as the continuity of family life, a link between generations. Fires were tended by grandparents, parents, children. Food was cooked over the same stones for decades. Conversations layered themselves into the air like invisible patina. Hestia, by association, becomes a goddess of shared memory. Not the memory of great battles, but the memory of everyday life. The laughter during meals, the quiet after losses, the feel of winter nights warmed by a steady glow, the relief of returning home. While there is no single myth that spells this out explicitly, the symbolism of Hestia and the hearth strongly suggests it. Scholars often note that household religion connected people to their ancestors. This could imply that Hestia's presence bridged past and present, not in sensational miracles, but in continuity. She is the goddess of nothing happening, and everything meaning something. Stories told beside the fire. We might also remember that storytelling itself, including the myths we're discussing, would often have been told by lamplight or firelight. Children would gather. Adults would listen while working with their hands. Flames would flicker. Shadows would dance. And Hestia would be there, as always, keeping the scene possible. It is almost poetic to imagine that all the dramatic tales of Zeus and Hera, Achilles and Odysseus, Theseus and Heracles, all the storms and monsters and triumphs, were told within Hestia's domain. Without her flame, there is no warm circle to gather in. Without that circle, there is no audience. Without the audience, there is no myth. So, although Hestia rarely enters the story as a character, she holds the space in which story itself happens. Quiet, steady, never intrusive. Always there. The edge of the firelight. The phrase, stories at the edge of the firelight, feels especially fitting here. Hestia is not the blaze that commands attention. She is the soft glow, where the light fades into shadow, the place where comfort meets imagination. She is the reminder that not all sacredness arrives with thunder. Sometimes it arrives as warmth. Sometimes it arrives as kindness. Sometimes it arrives as nothing happening at all, and that being exactly what you need. And in those moments, Hestia is fully present, even when she says nothing. Especially when she says nothing. If the hearth was the center of the home, then the idea of the hearth often became the center of thought. Ancient Greek poets, philosophers, and everyday speakers didn't always talk about Hestia as a literal goddess seated beside an actual fire. Sometimes they used her name and her symbol, the hearth, as a way to talk about order, beginnings, belonging, and the quiet heart of things. This doesn't mean every philosophical text pauses dramatically to thank Hestia for the steady warmth. But it does mean that the hearth became a shared metaphor, and where the hearth was, Hestia was never far away. So let's listen, calmly, to how that metaphor glows through Greek thought. Hestia as the center. In several ancient writings, the hearth is associated with the center of the world. This doesn't always mean a literal geographic middle. Rather, the hearth represents the point from which meaning radiates outward. You can imagine a city map, not with roads and buildings, but with emotional gravity. At the very middle sits the public hearth, the Prytaneion, and in countless homes, small hearths echo that central one, like lanterns lit from a single flame. Based on classical descriptions of civic life, this linking of hearths was not seen as coincidence. It reflected a worldview where community begins with warmth, and when philosophers wanted to talk about origin, the starting point of order, they could refer to the hearth in this symbolic way, not in a loud, triumphant tone, but in a calm, grounding one. It's as if the Greeks were saying, whatever the world becomes, it begins here, at warmth, at belonging, at stillness. And in that here, you can almost see Hestia sitting quietly. Hestia and the language of beginnings. In certain literary and poetic contexts, Hestia is connected with beginnings, not as explosions, but as calm openings. Rituals began with her. Prayers began with her. Offerings began with her. That repetition shaped the language of the sacred. Imagine a ceremony. The crowd gathers. The air is still. Someone steps forward, perhaps with a small bowl of wine or a piece of bread. Before any other god is invoked, the gesture is made toward Hestia. The implication is simple and profound. Before doing anything important, we create a space of peace. This habit enters thinking. It teaches that beginnings should be slow, respectful, grounded, that life doesn't start with noise, but with orientation. And Hestia becomes the divine embodiment of that orientation, that quiet before. Poetry by the firelight poets, ancient and modern alike, have long loved the image of the hearth, the flickering flame, the circle of light, the darkness beyond, the sense that stories and memories accumulate like soft ash. In Greek poetic traditions, the hearth sometimes symbolizes homecoming loyalty, domestic peace, continuity across generations. Even when Hestia's name isn't spoken, aloud, the weight of her presence sits behind the metaphor. When a character longs for home, what they often long for is the hearth. Not just comfort, but recognition. A place where their story is already understood without needing to be told. That's Hestia's language, even when others speak it. It's the language of, you belong here. You're safe here. Sit. Rest. Stay a while. The kind of phrases that make the edges of your mind soften. Hestia in philosophical thought. Gently, quietly, Greek philosophy, especially in later traditions, sometimes use the hearth metaphor to explore cosmic or ethical order. The details vary widely, and we should be cautious not to overstate any single connection. But the pattern that emerges is this. Wherever someone spoke of the true center, the grounding principle, the imagery of the hearth often wasn't far away. This could imply that Hestia's symbolic meaning extended far beyond household religion, into the way Greeks imagined stability itself. Think of it this way. If Heraclitus saw the cosmos as fire in constant change, Hestia's fire symbolized constancy within change. Not the wildfire, not the lightning strike, but the warm ember that doesn't go out. A dependable universe needs both movement and stability, and the hearth represented the latter. Again, philosophers didn't always name Hestia in these passages, but the cultural imagination already connected hearth to goddess, so the resonance would have been felt, even if only quietly. Speech itself, beginnings and endings. Just as rituals began with Hestia, some forms of speech rhetorically began by invoking the hearth as a symbolic starting point. It sets a tone. Before we talk of war or trade or travel or politics, we begin with the thought of home. We begin with warmth, food, family, hospitality, continuity, and we end there too. It's a profoundly grounding rhythm. Hestia, in this context, becomes a guardian of balance. No matter how far thought travels, it returns to the center. No matter how complex the argument, it rests finally in stillness. No matter how restless the world becomes, there is always a room somewhere with a small flame burning. And the thought itself becomes a comfort. Hestia as moral atmosphere. Some scholars suggest that the hearth helped define the moral atmosphere of Greek life. Kindness to guests, loyalty within families, reverence for the ancestors, shared meals, quiet dignity. This doesn't mean ancient life was always peaceful. History shows otherwise. But it does suggest that ideals of warmth and stability mattered deeply. Hestia becomes, in that sense, not just a goddess, but a standard. A gentle one. The measure is not, did you win? But rather, did you maintain the hearth, the bond, the belonging? And because Hestia does not punish or threaten, this standard feels less like a law and more like a memory of how things should be. Soft, reassuring, enduring. Everyday language, quiet references. It's likely that Greek people invoked the hearth in everyday speech, perhaps when speaking of homecoming, or gratitude, or welcome. While we don't always have direct conversational transcripts from antiquity, literature preserves enough hints to suggest this was so. And because Hestia was the hearth, she lived quietly in these phrases. She didn't need temples towering above cities to be remembered. She lived in idioms, in greetings, in the way someone might look toward the fire when thinking of absent loved ones. Her presence was linguistic as much as theological, and because language travels easily across time, she still lingers there, in the imagery of warm fires, safe homes, and quiet centers. A presence felt more than described. If we step back gently, we notice something. Hestia is one of the few deities who feels experienced rather than narrated. You don't need to see her in a story to understand her. You've already felt what she represents. The relief of walking into a warm room after a cold day, the comfort of familiar smells from a kitchen, the quiet of evenings where nothing more is required of you. The sense that home is not just walls, but welcome ancient Greeks would have felt these things too, every day. And in those feelings, Hestia lived. Not loudly, not with spectacle, but with steadiness. A philosopher might debate the nature of the soul. A poet might describe the beauty of the dawn. A general might speak of strategy and loyalty. But when they went home, when they crossed the threshold, removed sandals, sat near the fire, they moved into Hestia's realm. And the conversation softened. The hearth in the human heart, it isn't too much to say, cautiously, based on symbolic interpretation, that Hestia came to represent inner order, the place inside a person where thoughts finally rest, the steady flame that keeps identity warm and whole. When life is chaotic, noisy, uncertain, the mind seeks its own hearth, a quiet place, a centering breath, a return. Hestia lives in that metaphor too, and for thousands of years people have kept returning to it, not always by name but by instinct, because human beings need stillness as much as movement, and the hearth, both literal and symbolic, offers that without judgment or demand. Just warmth, just light, just enough. So as philosophy unfolded, as poetry flourished, as daily speech carried echoes of home and hospitality, Hestia's presence endured. Not because she insisted, but because the world needs a center, and she was willing to be it. Quietly, always,